Hey guys, so through all my days of using AI, I've come to see common flaws that are quite separate from intelligence, I would argue, but more have to do with approach. Sure, you can try to mitigate it by prompting better, I suppose, or you can try to write a custom list of settings and instructions for your AI that may or may not be respected. And it does help, I suppose. But these eccentricities are often not something you can teach AI out of on the spot. So, and the first one would be, truly, which I'm calling big. If you ask AI, very often you get big replies and a lot of changes, and often it doesn't modularize unless you tell it to explicitly. So you might end up with 2,000 line plus files, which is not that great. That AI, if tries to change, then usually fails to, but also it really struggles to, and I could really relate to that. Yet, let's suppose we are assuming modularity here. It makes a lot of changes at the same time, which is possibly okay early on, but later on it is kind of tricky. Because what would you hope for is the step and check style instead of the dump and run, which is what AI tends to prefer. So arguably it's not that systemic. You might be able to, well, usually you can tell it to test and handle errors and make files modular, but it usually just changes a lot of things anyway, and it would be, I suppose, expensive if it just like changed one line at a time. But this is just goes to show that it's kind of still struggling to leave behind its kind of like chatbot roots at this point, because what you would often see is that if you use the chatbot, then you just maybe ask for something and you get like a 10-minute reading, possibly. It could be possibly even more. And AI also gets itself into trouble with this approach, very much akin to a human would, because then you write the big ass file, or you make like 100 changes at the same time, and you don't know what is wrong. This approach would be the equivalent of like writing code for an hour in Notepad, then copying into VS Code, and then pressing run. So that's not super great. So in this case, it would be better to ask it to write modules and write functions, but many times it just writes like hundreds of lines at the same time. Yet, suppose you go small, right? In this case, it might not even make that much sense to ask AI to write it for you. It might make more of sense to possibly use inline AI that writes like a few lines at a time, or just write it yourself, possibly with the help of AI autocompletion. So currently, AI tends to either possibly autocomplete like 5 lines or so, or like 3, or write hundreds of lines. Possibly it could be less if you very specifically tell it to, but even in that case, it might be doing more. Possibly the second critique, I'm not sure this is a critique, just something that you have to keep in mind, that AI can't learn. So you could waste an entire day. You might think that you're making some progress. You're just telling AI things, and it might just realize it, but it would never will. And so suppose you might use a less common tool or library, and you might just tell AI things that, oh yeah, this work like this and work like that, and you're just wasting your time. AI will never get it. If you're not getting a good answer in like 3 tries, you're probably wasting your time and your sanity, and probably just gonna get worse and worse answers. I'm still specifying this because it is a very common, at least for me, mistake to make, and it's really hard to just completely abandon it because it feels so close. You're like, I just tell it the next thing and it's gonna work out, and like you're like, hours later you probably just made things worse. Especially combined with the last point, possibly, is that it rewrites or adds unrelated things. And this, strangely, works well with its own strategy of dump and run, because you dump like 300 lines, and like, let's say that 250 didn't work, so you rewrite that and you add like 200 more. But the rewrites are not correct either. So certainly AI could make improvements on its own, which are really much welcome. But it happened to me endless times that it added things that I'm just not sure why it added that, or revoked things that just worked perfectly. And that even made me a little bit reluctant to painstakingly write good code, because if AI thinks like, oh yeah, that is garbage, we gotta throw it out, then like, what is that? Sure, you can check line by line every single time just to make sure everything is right, but at that point, why not just like write the code yourself? Personally speaking, it can cause a bit of fatigue, because if you're just given like 300 lines of code, like, okay, I guess you can try to read that, and like, but you might, in some cases, you just say like, okay, I'll just take your word for it, and then you take your word for it again, and this kind of leads to problems. Also, many times the option is to accept the whole thing or just not, and that is also still so strange, because you might have like a file and like, okay, it had like, like 150 lines. It's like, yeah, that's a bit much. When things don't work, AI usually doesn't try to error check or possibly write test, but rewrites things. So I guess you can say that this is user error, but yeah, I guess that is important. So you gotta make sure you are using AIs correctly, but also how specific AIs possibly work. Also important to kind of learn, because I've noticed that lately AIs tend to modularize more, but they still write a lot. Yet it really depends on the AI though, because you can still have like long files. Just 2 weeks ago I ended up with like something that's like over 2,000 lines. It wasn't terribly structured, but that's not kind of how I would have done it. And I suppose that is a good point too, that you're pretty much not using your own style, but whatever style AI wants to do. And you can go against it. Say that, you align to my style. That's fine, but usually AI will try to enforce their style anyway. So pluses to using AI would be static, strong, and popular. You can have error checking, and tests. That's gonna work pretty well too. Apparently I can type. Also, very clear instructions in limited scope. You usually would not want to be writing hundreds of lines. I'm also adding functional style. I'm not saying pure functional, but as functional as possible. Because as the scale grows, AI won't be able to grasp it all, and neither will you. Suppose I can also add very clear variable names. I struggled with this so much, because what is possibly obvious to you may not be obvious to AI, and I had a project where I tried to give good variable names, truly, but AI misunderstood it. And that misunderstanding was the crux of why it was failing. So suppose you might name a variable site, right? It is for the site settings, or you might name it site settings, but it would be probably a better idea to name it custom per site settings, because that is gonna be clearer to AI. And I also had like a global settings, and that was not good enough for AI. That it just thought that it should be applied every time, which was not good. And also had a problem with like a disable setting, because okay, like I called it disable, but like, what is disabled? AI didn't know that. I knew that, but the AI didn't. And for me, it seemed obvious from its context, but AI does not. Honestly, this could be a really good idea, just even for humans, but I guess people might be lazy. But I mean, assuming you can write a longer variable name and it would be more appropriate, but you would have to write more. And honestly, that doesn't even matter these days because it would just get auto completed. But it would be, I would say it's more of a meta. Even if AI is good, it cannot help you unless it knows exactly what you want to do. Which brings the next point of project goal and specifics along with technologies. Now, you might be having this information somewhere else in most cases, but you probably should be having it inside your code, I suppose. Just for something for AI to reference, because it's gonna be no use to AI if you have fucking a doc file somewhere and you have a Kanban board and they don't know about it. AI tends to work better at the start of the project when the scale is not that crazy, and possibly you might not see the costs of it liberally making some decisions, which could be great decisions. So I'm not gonna say that it can be. But more and more the scale grows, those creative decisions could snowball and exponentially can cause problems. And let's even argue that AI is amazing. It can truly, possibly surpass all programmers. You would still need to very accurately describe what you want to do. I would say one common flaw that you can possibly fall into is that you start not understanding what AI is doing, and it might be right or not, you don't know, and you might be like pressing next on it, and eventually you're just lost, and the entire project could be lost too. You might have to go back to a previous state. And if the dump and run style works, I guess it could be just amazing. But generally speaking, that's not how progress is made. I mean, the step and check style is actually pretty effective. The dump and run could lead to, like, you might just write your code in 2 hours and spend the next 3 days just failing to kind of fix it. Even if it has like some weird bugs in it, you just cannot fix it. In fact, you might realize that it has like duplication in it, triplication of the same things. Because AI didn't see that it wrote the functions already, and like it maybe like managing state in like multiple different ways, and like the all the variable names are like, you know, kind of correct, but like, you know, that AI also wrote like a whole new type in a different components, like, and now using like 2 or 3 different types. Is like, ugh. And at that point, it would take more time to fix it than just to build it from scratch. So that's not that great. And if you're not careful, you never feel like that you're on sure ground while working with AI, because you don't know what works, because they just added like 2,000 lines in the last hour, I mean. Actually, let me add one more flaw, very common flaw that I already alluded to with my call to the functional style as much as possible, is myopia. Most AIs, from what I've experienced, don't tend to see, or at least keep in mind, the entire project. So suppose, even if they see the entire project, and you try to make your instructions as clear as possible, they might implement a local solution instead of a solution for your project. Now, this is not that bad, because I usually try to be as functional as possible. But in one project, it was kind of like semi-object oriented, and it was painful. And sure, future models might improve upon this, but it is just not a good approach. Yet, if you're not careful, AI is very much capable of just seeing the file, or maybe like the nearby files, and just trying to do some kind of local solution, irrespective of what else is going on. The more moving pieces you have, the way to get it wrong goes up exponentially. Also, another point worth highlighting, that if AI writes code, then also it uses that code in the future as reference. So that is so much worse than a little bit fuzzy variable names. Now, if you have bad code somewhere, then AI tries to expand your project based on that bad code. This can be really bad. Like, it might just write some bad code and then try to rewrite the entire project based on that one bad code and just entirely corrupting it. Sure, you should be paying attention, but the point is, AI would 100% do this. Especially if you combine it with the can't learn aspect of it. So one flaw you can fall into is that suppose you have no idea what you're doing in this area, so you keep prompting AI. AI cannot learn, so it just keeps trying worse things and treats that new code as its religion and rewrites the entire project in worse and worse ways. So you would not want to be accepting bad code because it's gonna be used as reference, and it might be rewritten, possibly, if you get lucky, but unlikely no. And this is extra bad with its tendency to write a lot of things at the same time. Just break long files, just dump and run it, and some of it is bad, and that's gonna be used as future reference. So that's it, guys. AI is cool. I definitely love it, but not magic.